Alright, I'm going to now demonstrate the common failure simulations that you might be given to you when you're taking your Washington Department of Health backflow assembly test exam, your practical exam. And I'm going to do this on a double check valve assembly, so I'm going to show you the common things that they could possibly throw at you while you're testing a double check valve assembly. So I'm going to notify, identify, inspect, and observe. When I go to test my double check valve assembly, I'm going to make sure I'm testing the double check valve assembly, which happens to be this one right here. It says so on the tag, so I know that that's my double check valve assembly. It looks very similar to the RP, but it does not have a relief valve. That's another clue. And it also has arrows cast on the body to tell me what my direction of flow is. So I've got test cock 1, test cock 2, test cock 3, test cock 4, shut off valve number 1, shut off valve number 2. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and flush my test cocks. So flush test cock number 1, flush test cock number 2, flush test cock number 3, flush test cock number 4. Again, I like using a sight tube, so I'm going to go ahead and put my sight tube on test cock number 3, and I'm going to fill the sight tube full of water. Alright, then I'm going to put my compensating valve on test cock number 2, and again, I like pointing my compensating valve towards shut-off valve number 1. I'm going to be using a Midwest 5-valve kit. Again, the only hose I need is the high side hose. It's the only hose I have hooked up, and so I'm going to now hook my high side hose up to the compensating valve. The other thing to be aware of if you're using one of these types of kits is that you do not want to cover up your other connections here, because this connection specifically needs to be opened up to atmosphere. If you do not, if you put your hand over it, it'll give you an invalid reading, or give you a bad reading. So I'm going to open up test cock number 2, if I can find the slot, and that'll drive my gauge to the upper end. You may have noticed it gurgled and spit some water out of this particular port. That's fine, it's supposed to do that. Next, I'm going to purge some water out of the test kit, make sure my hose doesn't have any air in it, make sure I got the air out of the test kit. So I'm running water out of the test kit by opening the high side bleed valve. I'm going to close the high side bleed valve. Alright, and at this point I'm going to close shut off valve number 2. I'm going to elevate my test kit so that the center line of my test kit is even with the sight tube. I'm going to close shut off valve number 1. I'm going to take my screwdriver and open up test cock number 3. And observe what's happening in the sight tube. Well, I would have thought by now that the flow would have stopped going in the sight tube, so I still have flow continuing through the sight tube, so I have water coming into the body of the assembly from somewhere, and so now I need to determine where it's coming from. And the way you determine that is, now I'm going to open up my compensating valve and see what happens. So I'm going to open up my compensating valve, and I notice that as I open up my compensating valve more and more, my flow in my sight tube is reduced, and the flow from my compensating valve continues to go. Now the reason why I like to point it at shutoff valve number 1 is if it continues to flow out of my compensating valve, that reminds me that my leak is shutoff valve number 1. So in this case I have a leaking shutoff valve number 1. Okay. If it were shutoff valve number 2 leaking, well, first of all, the check valve would have had to fail. And then if this check valve was working, the water would stop. So I have a leaking shutoff valve number 1. And the other thing you can observe is when I close my compensating valve, the flow increases out of my sight tube. Alright, so that's what a leaking shutoff valve number 1 looks like. If I were taking the exam, I would say, Proctor, I've got a leaking shutoff valve number 1, in which case the proctor would go, problem has been corrected. Now you would need to back up and retest. So I would close my test cock to my sight tube. I would repressurize everything. Then I would elevate, isolate, and test, and continue on with the test. Well, for the sake of time, I'm going to show you another simulation. So, excuse me, I'm ready to test my check valve number 1 here. So I'm going to open up my test cock and watch my gauge. And I'm looking at the monitor so I can kind of see what's going on. And lo and behold, my gauge has dropped below 1 psid. Remember, the minimum value is 1 psid. So since the value is below 1 psid, in fact now it's 0, that tells me that I have a failed check valve. So again, if I were taking the exam, I would say, Proctor, I have a failed check valve number 1. In which case the proctor would say, problem has been corrected. Again, you would back up a step, and you would back up a step by closing the test cock, repressurizing the assembly, and continuing on. Alright, so again, I'm going to simulate another fault for you. So I'm getting ready here to test my assembly. So I flushed the test cocks, I've done all that. I'm going to elevate, I'm going to reach down and isolate. I'm going to test check valve number 1. So I'm going to open up the test cock. Oh, wait a minute. I haven't opened up the test cock yet. I haven't done anything yet. And I've noticed that the pressure in my gauge is dropping. Well, what that tells me is that water's leaving the assembly. And essentially, what it's really indicating to me and what I'm going to say in my mind is, I bet I've got a leaking shutoff valve number 2. Okay, so what's happening is the pressure's being relieved out of the body by going past check valve number 2 and out shutoff valve number 2. So I would essentially have, I would suspect, but I will confirm here in a minute, that I have a leaking number 2 shutoff valve with flow. Okay, now my gauge is still above 1 psid. I can still perform the test on check valve number 1. So I'm going to open my test cock to my sight tube, and I'm going to keep an eye on it, and I'm going to wait for the water to stop flowing in the sight tube. It's still rising a little bit. And for my gauge to stabilize, alright, it's stopped flowing now. And I have a value of 2.0 psid. So check valve number 1 holds tight at 2.0 psid. Okay, in this case now what I'm going to do is I'm going to set down my gauge. I'm going to move my test equipment down, but I'm keeping in the back of my mind that I suspect that I have a problem with shutoff valve number 2. So I'm going to go ahead and move my test equipment down. All right, again, I'm going to make sure that my sight tube's full of water. Oops. Helps if you turn shutoff valve number 1 on so that you have pressure. It also helps if you close the test cocks. You know, these are not things that would fail you. They're just things that get things wet, like myself. So I'm going to close shutoff valve number 2, or open shutoff valve number 1. So sorry about that. I am going to fill my sight tube full of water. I'm going to open up test cock number 3, which repressurized my gauge. Again, I'm going to purge my gauge, make sure there's no air in the gauge. I'm going to elevate my test kit to the level of the sight tube, so the center line is elevated to the level of the sight tube. I'm going to close shutoff valve number 1, and I've noticed that the same thing's happening where my pressure is dropping in my gauge. All right, I can now open up test cock number 4, and I observe that the water is draining out of my sight tube. Well, the only way the water is going to drain out of the sight tube in this case is if this shutoff valve is leaking and I got flow downstream. Now, you notice I lowered my gauge with the level of the water. Okay, in the real world, you can get a valid reading for check valve number 1 in this case if you lower the gauge to where the water's draining out, which would be the elevation of this discharge piping, and in which case I get a check valve number 2 value of 2.0 psid. In the exam, what you would do is you would say, Proctor, I have a number 2 shutoff valve that is leaking with flow downstream, in which case the proctor would say, problem has been corrected, and you would back up and retest. I'm going to remember this time to close my test cock. So I would back up by closing my test cock. I would open shutoff valve number 1. I would refill my sight tube full of water. To be on the safe side, I'm going to repurge the assembly. And I'm going to elevate, isolate, and test check valve number 2. And again, when the water stops flowing and the gauge is stabilized, you can read a value. And I get a value of 2.2 psid. A little bit different than when I got before when I lowered my gauge down to here, but it's within the accuracy of the gauge. So check valve number 2 passes with a value of 2.2 psid. Okay, so now you can close the test cock and continue on with the test. Okay, well, to show you some other simulations that could possibly happen while you're doing the assembly. So I've already tested check valve number 1. I've moved on to check valve number 2. My hose again is wrapped up on me. I'm going to unwrap it. Okay, I'm going to fill my sight tube full of water. I'm going to turn on test cock number 3. I'm going to purge my assembly. I'm going to set up another simulation. All right. So I'm going to elevate, isolate, and test. So I'm going to open up test cock number 4. All right, and again, water continues to flow from the side tube. So that tells me that water is entering the body of the assembly from somewhere. Now I need to determine where. Again, you're going to go over to your compensating valve, which I've pointed at shutoff valve number 1, and I'm going to open it up and see what happens. Well, when I open it up, well, I notice my flow goes down a little bit, but the key thing is water keeps flowing out of the compensating valve toward shutoff valve number 1. So that tells me shutoff valve number 1 is leaking. Now, I used to think this was bogus, but it really isn't, because remember, between check valves, you're opening and closing shutoff valve number 1. You could potentially get something like a piece of Teflon tape in the ball valve between when you test the assembly, so it is possible that it doesn't leak when you test check valve number 1, and could possibly leak when you do check valve number 2. So again, I would say, Proctor, I have a leaking shutoff valve number 1. And again, I can reconfirm by when I close the compensating valve, the amount of water that comes out of the side tube increases. All right, so I've told Proctor I've got a leaking shutoff valve number 1. He's going to go, problem's been corrected. And again, you would back up by closing the test cock, opening shutoff valve number 1, and continuing on with the test. All right, so now I'm going to show you another simulation. So again, I'm going to purge my test kit. I'm going to elevate, isolate, and test by opening test cock number 4. So I open test cock number 4, and I watch my gauge. I'm watching it in the monitor, and lo and behold, it's gone below 0. Or it's not gone below 0, it's gone below 120, so my check valve number 2 has failed. So I would say, Proctor, check valve number 2 has failed. Proctor would say, problem's been corrected. And again, you're going to back up again. You're going to close the test cock, open up shutoff valve number 1 to repressurize the assembly, and move on. All right, so I've got one more simulation I need to do for you. So again, I'm getting ready to test check valve number 1. My side tube's full. I've purged my assembly. I'm going to elevate, isolate, and test. So I'm going to open up my test cock number 4 and observe what happens. So again, water continues to flow from the assembly, so I've got water coming in. To figure out where, I'm going to open up my my compensating valve. In this case, my compensating valve actually stops flowing water. Okay, so what that tells me is the water's not coming from shutoff valve number 1 through here. It's actually coming through shutoff valve number 2 with back pressure against the check valve and out through the side tube. So I have a leaking number 2 shutoff valve with back pressure. All right, in which case the Proctor will say, problem's been corrected, and I would close my compensating valve, close my test cock, open up shutoff valve number 1. I would purge my assembly just to be on the safe side. I would elevate, isolate, and test. All right, wait for the water to stop flowing out of the side tube, still rising slightly. And the gauge is stabilized. and I have a value of 2.1 PSID, so check valve number 2 holds tight at 2.1 PSID. I'm going to set my equipment down, close test cock number 4, close test cock number 3, slowly open shut off valve number 1, slowly open shut off valve number 2, remove my test equipment, and I would be done. And now I'm done testing the double check valve assembly, and I would fill out my test report legibly, accurately, and completely. Alright, so that would be the end of doing my double check valve assembly, in which case I would say, Proctor, I'm done testing the double check valve assembly, and hopefully he will say, which assembly would you like to test next?